First of all, thank you for coming on my show to chat with me. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
I'm sure you're swamped.
It's a busy time, I think, for journalists. Bad news is always busy times for journalists, and there's been a lot of bad news. I've been writing a lot about COVID-19, and it's surprising how busy your schedule can become even when you're not leaving the house. That's been my life for the last couple of months.
That's funny. It's funny because I've been super busy also. Like I feel like I'm busier now than I was before.
Yeah,
And
I had a really interesting conversation with a guy who works at a restaurant a couple of blocks from me because half the restaurants had closed in my neighborhood, and the other half were just available for takeout and delivery. And he told me something interesting. He said that of the people he knows, they're either not working at all, or if they're working like 80 hours a week. And I think that's true for a lot of people. Anybody who's in the business of journalism, employment lawyers, certain kinds of EMS workers. Uh, and if you are working, it does feel really busy. But it's really segmented. Like I was talking to a doctor friend of mine, and not all doctors are busy. Like some doctors have no business because they're dermatologists or something. And so people who are getting elective surgeries are just canceling them all. So, and I'm sure the same is true of journalists. I'm sure they're like sports journalists, for instance. I'm sure this is a tough and maybe boring time to be a sports journalist. So, in a dark, ironic way, I consider myself lucky that I have stuff to write about because I'm writing about the bad news.
yeah. So, I guess, well, first of all, how has lockdown been treating you? I mean, how have you been experiencing the whole, I don't want to say lockdown because I feel like in Canada we didn't really go on lockdown in the same way as they did in some other countries. I feel like more
Right?
it was like directions and encouragement. And of course, they shut down businesses, but I haven't personally felt that I've been on lockdown at all, really. So I don't know, social isolation perhaps is a better way to describe it.
So I have three kids, and I think if you're a parent, the real the real dividing line is jurisdictions where kids are going to school and where they're not. My former Quillette colleague, she's now become editor in chief of another publication. Her name is Paulina Nuding. She was just telling me that in Sweden, not only are kids allowed to go to school, but they have to go to school. And in Quebec, where my sister lives, in coming days, kids could go to school, but parents couldn't hold them back. So I think the schools are going to just be fractionally full. Here in Toronto, where I live, no kids are going to school. And if you're a parent and you've got three kids at home, it feels like lockdown. Especially, it's tough. It's actually much tougher on the youngest kid. The oldest kids, I have teenage girls, and it's actually incredible what digital technology does. Like my eldest, every night she's on Fortnite or other first-person shooter games, and half the time they're not even shooting each other. They're just talking and hanging out and telling jokes. So my older kids have found ways to connect, but to have everybody in the house almost 24 hours a day, I don't think lockdown is an incorrect word. It does feel like uh, we'd like to get out of here in a week or two.
I mean, like I say that with, I hate I mean, I miss my friends. I miss doing normal things. I miss being around people a lot. I'm really tired of this. I really want to get out of it. When I say, I don't want to call it lockdown, it's because I'm still, I go out for walks every day. I go out and do stuff. I'm out with my dog. Like we can still, I go to the grocery store. I go get takeout. I've seen friends. But of course, I don't want to pretend that it's glorious. I mean, it's incredibly difficult, and I feel like I've been able to cope with it. First of all, because I already work at home. I'm obviously used to being out and about a lot more and traveling and having meetings with people or whatever, but there's lots and lots of work that I can do at home. And because I live alone, I think that actually has made it easier, ironically.
So a lot of this is exacerbating trends that already existed in terms of income inequality. Like, give you an example, there's someone I know who runs a chain of movie theaters. And one of the first things he did was all the entry level employees who sell popcorn and take tickets and clean the theater, he laid them off because their jobs didn't exist anymore because there were no customers, and there won't be for another month or two. Whereas his management team, these were the people who were negotiating with the insurers and negotiating with landlords, um, and figuring out what new government mandates there were. All of those middle managers and upper managers, they kept their jobs. And I think this is true in a lot of organizations where there are white collar workers who can do their work from home, who are so-called knowledge workers, college educated. You know, I guess it includes journalists, even though the industry it's had tough times the last few years. And those people, a lot of them are, I don't want to say they're flourishing because it's an anxious time, but a lot of those people are keeping their jobs, and a lot of those people have actually become more indispensable to their organizations. Like if you're, say, a labor lawyer, or you're in the insurance industry, or a lot of these jobs, these people are very busy because their services are much in demand. Uh, but on the other end of the spectrum, some of the people who are already having a lot of trouble, personal care workers, restaurant workers. Here in Toronto, we have a huge tourist industry, same as Vancouver, I know. If you are in the tourist industry, if you work on a cruise ship, if you work in a bar, and these are things like if you operate a bar, I don't know when bars are coming back. I think schools may come back in a couple of weeks, but bars, Rogers Stadium with Blue Jays, Argonauts, all that stuff. I mean, that may be a year or two away. And there's tens of thousands of people who work at these places. I really feel bad for them.
I know. Yeah, I feel awful for them. You're right, and anybody working in events in the service industry. I mean, I'm sort of assuming, so I mean, you might have a better idea than I that small bars and restaurants that you can sort of regulate in terms of how many people are in there and how close they are together might be able to come back. But of course, you're not going to have big party spaces where people are wandering around and spitting in each other's faces or.
Yeah, I think that like the sort of the prototypical sort of corner bistro where it's mostly food and wine and stuff. I think sit down places where the geography of the place is more tightly regulated, that may be easier to get back. But one of the things you see, some of the patterns that I've looked at in terms of the spread of the disease, the noisier the environment is, the more you sometimes see major COVID-19 spreading events. And I think that's because in noisy environments, bars, après-ski, there was a lot of examples of that. People are just they're shouting in each other's faces to make themselves heard over the noise. And if you think, I mean, it's been a while since I spent a big part of my life in noisy bars, but that's kind of what it is, right? People drinking, they lose their inhibitions, riskier behavior, screaming at each other, dancing, singing, all that stuff. If you run a karaoke bar, I, who knows when you're going to come back into business? Like it's sad because it's all the stuff that people love doing, right? Like cheering for a sports team, singing clubs, uh, hanging out with friends, bars, backyard barbecues, having beers on weekends, all that stuff. It's like the most dangerous form of activity. And yeah, it's going to be a long time until this comes back. But it is kind of surreal because I'm like you that, uh, I spent Saturday, I went for a long bike ride. I saw lots of people. The grocery stores are full of food. It doesn't feel like we're in some kind of crisis when you're by Lake Ontario bicycling around, or in some of the parks you're allowed to go into, others are not. It feels normal, and it's a little surreal because a lot of people are hurting, especially older people who can't leave their old age homes and stuff. But then I have a lot of freedom, so I go out and it feels fun and normal, and like I'm able to do my job from my computer. So it's a weird kind of halfway crisis feeling where something is deeply wrong, but it's not, in my case at least, I'm fortunate it's not affecting me or my family that much.
What do you think is going to happen to all those businesses, especially the small businesses, the little bars, the little restaurants, the shops?
I mean, a lot of them are going to go out of business, but it's interesting because I had a very interesting conversation with my dry cleaner, and I was joking with her because I said like you must have no business because dry cleaners, uh, a lot of it is people who go to work and they're wearing suits or dresses or whatever, and they get their expensive clothes cleaned, or formal wear for weddings and bar mitzvahs and stuff. No one is having weddings and bar mitzvahs, so I assume she'd have no business. And she said actually her business is great because she does reparations and alterations, and everyone is spending the lockdown period sort of cleaning out their attic, trying on clothes, and people are coming to her with big heaps of clothes that they haven't worn for 5 years and getting them altered. So I was surprised, and she said that her income is kind of okay because, and again, it's really interesting. Sort of, she patched together income sources. So she's got like maybe 50% income from her business. She's getting $2,000 from the government. Her landlord is giving her a break on rent. So she negotiated informally a 50% rent break. And I forget, she had some other income source. I think it was like some zero interest loan from Ontario. But it was like a patchwork of stuff that she's going to use to get by. And she told me that with all that stuff, she's able to survive. But if one of those sources broke down, like let's say her landlord didn't give her a break, or let's say no one was coming in with alterations, she had some kind of business, like she ran a dance studio or something like that, where it's like zero business. If anything I just described, if those income sources didn't come through, that would have been it. And so I think there's a lot of people like that who are patching stuff together, like loans and savings and government support and a trickle of business. But it's very delicate. And I know in my neighborhood, this dry cleaner was telling me I think her rent is it's like $5,000 a month or something, which sounds like a lot, but these days it's not uncommon. But she said, around the corner in the most fashionable area of my neighborhood, where there's a lot of nice restaurants, they're paying 15,000 a month. And she told me, she said she's talked to people like that, and they are going to go out of business in a couple of weeks because once the second or third rent payment hits, that's it. They don't have the money to pay that.
Right. And I wonder, I mean, in Vancouver, the film industry is huge. I don't know how much so in Ontario and other provinces, but I sort of wonder what will happen to that industry, partly because so many people in Vancouver are employed by the film industry. And that's a lot of Americans coming in,
Yeah.
film and yeah, ads that are being filmed here, and they're American people, and they employ thousands of people in Vancouver.
Yeah, and also that is an industry which is based, as you said, so much on travel. And if you can't, all it takes is you not being able to bring in, one actor or one art director, and the whole production is suspended. The other thing about the film industry is that it is incredibly thinly capitalized. Uh, I know some people who work in the industry, and often, the difference between doing a shoot one week or doing it the next week is, whether the next tranche of your government subsidy, your bank loan comes in, and they don't have deep pockets. So I think industries that are really heavily capitalized, some obvious examples like banks and stuff, and they're going to do just fine. Um, but the thinly capitalized industries, which include restaurants, unfortunately, I mean, restaurants go out of business all the time, even when there's no pandemic. So, restaurants, bars, entertainment, certain kind of vacation companies, charters, events. You got to feel terrible for some guy who runs an event space and, he's got 6 months or 12 months worth of cancellations. That's the end of his business. It doesn't matter if he, gets a check for a couple of thousand a month from the government. He's got to find a new line of work. And there's millions of people across the country like that.
So, what do you think? I mean, this is an oversimplified question, but what's worse, the social isolation and the impact on the economy and business and individuals, or the pandemic itself? And I'm asking that question because, of course, people are making those arguments, so-called
Right.
lockdown skeptics, or some of them are coronavirus skeptics, but some of them are really just critical of
Right.
the lockdown per se. They don't think that the pandemic is invented necessarily, although there are people who think that. But their argument, of course, is that the impact socially and on the economy, on people, is worse than if we had just let this go.
So I disagree with that argument. I take that argument seriously in the sense that, let's say in Canada, let's say ultimately by the end of the year, the death toll is, take your pick. Let's say it's 5,000 or 10,000. You could make the argument and say, look, you're going to get an uptick in the death rate. That's true, but you're going to get all these mental health issues from people being behind closed doors. There's going to be more suicides. Marriages are going to break up. There's going to be all these horrible things that happen. Bankruptcy and poverty and homelessness themselves are causes of a lot of physical health and mental health breakdown. So you could make the argument, and again, I respect that argument. The reason I think that the government in all Western countries had no choice but to enter into a fairly strict lockdown mode was that the way human psychology works it was never really a trade-off between having a robust economy and going into lockdown mode. That was a false dichotomy. It was never going to happen. And the reason is because everybody was I don't even want to use the word panic. Everyone was scared. And if you look at the data from things like transit usage or the amount people were spending or airline travel, like even before governments instituted lockdowns, people were holding up in their homes. Major employers were sending people home from office buildings days or sometimes weeks before they had to. And it became pretty clear that the way human psychology works is lockdown or no lockdown, the economy wasn't going to become functional again until people felt safe. And people were not going to feel safe until they felt this thing was under control. And I'll give you an example. My sister lives in Montreal, and in Quebec, parents are very soon, I think maybe next week, going to have the option of sending their kids back to school, yeah, elementary school kids. I think middle school and high school, I think the year is done. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's the distinction. And for if you look at the data, asymptomatic kids, safe environment, clean environment, uh, it's very safe cohort of the population. And yet, among my sister's peer group, a lot of people are just refusing to send their kids back to school, even though the statistics suggest that at this point and in the circumstances they're doing it, it's going to be safe. They're scared. So if they're scared in that situation, go back to 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago, how horrified people were. There was never any real possibility. I get the argument lockdown skeptics make, but lockdown skeptics are making this utilitarian argument which bore no relationship to the actual psychology of the people who are supposed to be the suppliers and the consumers of the economy that they imagined was going to blossom once we all decided we weren't going to lock down. That was never going to happen. The government was, to a certain extent, ratifying the fears we already had.
Hmm. Do you know if, what, so they're sending kids back to school in Quebec and in Ontario. Is that happening in all provinces
No,
or?
it's province by province. In Ontario, um, my kids are probably not going to go back to school this semester. Um, I think, I mean, there might be some sort of like theoretical period, maybe in very late May or early June when the kids have 1 or 2 weeks of classroom activity. But right now, if I had to predict, I don't think any of my 3 kids will be going back to school, despite the fact that certainly in the case of my youngest kid, I would feel pretty safe sending them back to school. If you look at places like Switzerland and Sweden, US states, Australia, parts of Australia, not all parts of Australia. My boss's kids are back in school in Australia. Like I said, Paulina's kids in Sweden. Not only do they have the option of going to school in Sweden, they have to go to school because you're not allowed to homeschool in Sweden. So it's and I think it's sensible. I think the statistics are such that for young asymptomatic kids, it is safe to send them back to school, as long as maybe they're not going back to a household that has older people, because obviously they're extremely vulnerable. But right now, I would feel very safe sending my young kid to elementary school.
Do you think that the lockdowns were worth it?
They were worth it in the sense that they were the only thing that was going to mollify people's anxiety. So you're a journalist. I remember, God, this is going back to, I'd say, mid-March. I was getting DMs on Twitter from people I barely knew saying, "Pray for me. I just coughed. I think, I went to Starbucks earlier. I think I have a fever." Like people were freaking out. And one journalist who's written for me, I've written for him, I think, he was one of these guys. He sent me this really freaked out email. And for every person who's writing and sending an email like that, there's 100 others who are thinking that. And in that environment, it's almost moot to say, was it worth it or not worth it? Like you had to do it. There was no option, because otherwise it's the worst of both worlds. Because you're not going to get your economy going at that point because everyone's terrified and no one's going out, no one's going to restaurants, no one's going to sports events. So you're not going to get your economy going, but at the same time, you're not addressing people's anxieties because there are a few people going out and the government hasn't yet instituted a blanket policy of lockdown. So people don't get the assurance that says, okay, we're in lockdown mode, things are going to get better, but the economy is also not doing well because people are horrified. So I think the government had no choice. Say it was worth it or not worth it. The real question was it worth it for us to experience this level of anxiety? I gotta say, I started experiencing, I'm not sure anxiety is the right word, but serious concern when I saw some of the stories coming out of Italy, because that was a real wake up call for a lot of people. I think there was a lot of people, I wouldn't call it racism per se, but they knew that there was something bad going on in China. And in their mind, they thought, well, okay, maybe it's going to stay in China. When Italy, and particularly Bergamo, which is this, it's northeast of Milan, and it was sort of the epicenter of the epidemic in Lombardy in, I guess, early mid March. I mean, the scenes were horrific. It was really bad. Yeah, I'm sure everyone's seen that photo of army trucks lined up outside a hospital because there were so many bodies. I don't know how over dramatized some of the reporting on that was, but there was one local paper in Bergamo that the entire edition, every edition was just death notices. And I looked at that and I heard people in my social media feed saying it's just the flu. I was like, look, this isn't the flu. The flu doesn't cause every year newspapers to run entire issues of death notices. And that was the moment that I think for a lot of people, they said, we cannot let Toronto and Montreal turn into Bergamo, Italy. Uh, I think we responded a little bit too late, but I don't think it was an illegitimate reaction to get really terrified when that moment came.
Do you think that the World Health Organization dealt with this all well? They early on were getting information from China, and some would argue that that meant that the US and Canada were they didn't take precautions early enough. They were fed inaccurate information. The World Health Organization didn't call this a pandemic until mid-May, a little bit earlier than
Or,
mid-May.
or
And
mid-March,
sorry,
mid-March.
yeah, thank you. Like I think March 9th or something. And so of course people were traveling into the US and Canada from China for too long, from Italy, from Iran. I mean, how do you think they handled it? Could they have done better? Did they make
So
mistakes?
so I think the as I think is now pretty well known, is the WHO depended for a lot of its data and information on China. China itself, I think, is a little bit more of a complicated story than some people like to think on both sides. It is absolutely true that from what we know, in the first few weeks of what we now know became a pandemic, Chinese officials, locally certainly, did try and cover this up, and people were worried about losing their jobs and losing face and getting in trouble with their superiors and losing tourism and shutting down Wuhan, which is a major commercial hub. Um, and in that period, corresponding to early January, there were precious weeks that were lost because the response was slow. And also, there was at one point, a real cover up where whistleblowers were told to shut up, and voices that could have alerted the world to what was happening were suppressed. If that's where the story stopped, I think China is 100% the villain and the bad guy, and the WHO is complicit for listening to them. What happened, however, was that once China escalated this to the national level and began to see what the threat was, you see in China there was a transformation in the response. And by the time a WHO fact finding team arrived in China, and I think they were there for like 10 or 11 days, and they released their report, I think the report came out February 28th or something like that. I've read that report. I've based some of my own reporting on it. There are things that we know are wrong in that report. For instance, the report indicates that there's a very low transmission rate to healthcare workers, which we now know simply isn't true. But the epidemiology in the report, I mean, a lot of it has stood up. And the Chinese also were very proactive once they took it seriously about getting the virus sequenced. They participated with the WHO and the international community in sending doctors around the world in developing tests. There are kind of two Chinas here. There's the China that was trying to suppress this, And then there was the China that said, okay, we're not going to suppress this. Let's do what we can. And there are nations around the world that actually have Chinese doctors working there helping save lives. I don't want to paint a heroic picture of China. I think China also did all kinds of cynical things in recent weeks to burnish their own image and to spread propaganda and even to interfere with social media networks in the West. Um, China is an authoritarian country, and to the extent it's helping others, I don't think it's out of the goodness of its heart. And it continues to try and marginalize Taiwan, which has had a model response to COVID-19. And the WHO, unfortunately, has followed China's lead, as it always does, in terms of marginalizing Taiwan. And that's reprehensible. But I think it's a more complicated story than simply, on both sides you see this. You see people trying to whitewash China, and you also see people trying to completely demonize China. And I think it depends what time frame you're looking at. As for the WHO is, among other things, a monstrous bureaucracy. And to get it to change policy on many issues, it's like turning around a super tanker in the ocean. It takes a long time. And just, the example everyone looks at is masks. Uh, the science promoting mask usage was, from what I was looking at, it was pretty solid already in March, I guess late March. And then, they drag their feet on it, causing national health officials, like as here in Canada, who were essentially just parroting whatever the WHO was saying. We lost weeks of progressing our policy because we were just kind of reading WHO press releases. And that in itself is kind of a little bit of scandal. Like, why does Canada and other countries have public health officials if their only job is just to read WHO guidelines? Like, we have our own independent scientists. We have public officials who are capable of understanding the emerging peer-reviewed literature. And there was a period of several weeks when it was fairly clear that masks were indicated for at least a certain part of the population. And here in Canada, you had public health officials saying, don't wear masks because the WHO says so. I think that's ridiculous.
So how do you think that, public health officials responded in Canada? I mean, I've paid attention mostly to BC, so I don't know how closely you've paid attention to BC, and I feel that we've done pretty well because Bonnie Henry is a pretty clear communicator. I'm not sure. I mean, Teresa Tam to me seemed like she was just repeating
Yeah.
whatever the WHO was saying, and then that ended up being bad information or not
So yeah,
great
at the at the at
information.
the at the national level, the messaging wasn't great. I mean, a lot of this is symbolic because in Canada, health is a largely a provincial jurisdiction. So actually, things like running hospitals and public health networks, I mean, the heavy lifting is done by the provinces. But the federal government has a large symbolic function, and it has a large policy function when it comes to, like, say, international travel, things like that, which fall under federal jurisdiction. The messaging wasn't great because, again, Teresa Tam, a lot of it was just whatever the WHO said yesterday, that's our policy today. That's not reassuring to Canadians, and it ended up being bad science. And the other thing is, Teresa Tam, like other federal government officials, sometimes in discussing policy issues like international travel, there's a lot of like extraneous tangents about racism and um, things that weren't really germane to the debate. Like here in Toronto, some of the people who were most concerned about COVID-19 were themselves people of East Asian ancestry who had a closer informational and cultural connection to some of the areas where COVID-19 had already hit. And they were the people who were being very careful about public transportation and who were grilling people about where they'd been traveling. There was a school board in the Toronto area where parents were concerned about kids going to school if they had been to the Wuhan area of China. And that was denounced by white people as racist. Whereas I think there were East Asian people in the neighborhood who, some of them, they were concerned about this because they knew more about the disease than a lot of the local politicians. Those factors, I think, really turned off a lot of Canadians who, they wanted health information. They didn't want to be lectured about how they were too dumb to wear masks or, they were bigots if they opposed international travel, that kind of thing. At the provincial level, I think Doug Ford got high marks for his response. Legault, his ratings, I think, soared in Quebec. A lot of the mayors were a mixed bag. Uh, you know, the mayor of Ottawa, whose name escapes me, he has become particularly notorious because Ottawa became, I think, like the strictest city, like crazy strict and stupid strict. I think at one point they had a policy where you could walk through a park, but you couldn't sit on a bench. And at one point, for a period of I think 2 or 3 days, they had a policy. I'm not making this up. You were not allowed to wave at your grandparents in an old age home through the glass because it was seen like, well, maybe if you do that, people will collect around the window. I mean, it was just such just unvarnished bullshit. And I think uh, they were so embarrassed by that policy they walked back. Like the mayor announced, well, actually, we're taking that policy back. But here in Toronto, there's a guy who got $880 fine for I think doing a pull up in a city park by himself. There was a guy in Wasaga Beach who got an $880 fine for bird watching. He actually posted his
For bird
the
watching.
document. Yeah, so he was in this public park and people were walking and he stopped and took out his binoculars and started looking at birds and some guy wrote him a ticket for 880. I mean, just insane.
But what was he doing? Like,
Very
what was he was standing too
he was
close to
looking for birds.
people? Or,
He was like bird watching, like the activity is right there. Like he was just standing there watching birds. And this happened to be one of these jurisdictions where you could walk through the park, but you could stop,
okay.
which is insane. Like that's not, the public health science on COVID-19. We now know that you don't get it from, it's not magic fairy dust that just, spreads through a park. The primary mechanisms for getting it is something like coughing, sneezing, ballistic transmission of infected droplets from one person to another, which is not really a risk when you're in a thinly populated outdoor area. The greatest risk is when you're standing very close to people, especially in indoor spaces, poorly ventilated, and people are yelling or screaming or cheering, that kind of thing. That's where the spread of the disease is most notable. And it's just been disgusting to watch power-hungry mayors, handing out fines to people for perfectly safe behavior in parks and other public spaces.
Right. So I think that there is a difference in terms of my perspective, because in Vancouver, I've not heard of anyone being fined for anything, and we've all still
No,
been out at the park. No, I mean, I've gone to
I
the
think
park with friends,
your
and there's lots
yeah,
of
your
people there.
provincial officials at one point they were encouraging people to go outside.
Yeah.
There was one tweet I forget who I think was a provincial official. I, the
I
tweet I
think
saw he
Bonnie
quite right.
Henry told us to go outside.
Yeah, and by the way, when you're outside, you have to be responsible. It's possible to get the disease outside as much as inside if you behave irresponsibly. But I was glad to see that your public health officials in BC are much more realistic about how you get the disease. There's a certain I don't know how much to extrapolate, but like Ontario does have this kind of like prissy small town Victorian like cultural roots buried under the surface of it being a cosmopolitan city, and I think the same is true of Ottawa. And you don't have to scratch the surface a lot to find these sort of very, somewhat puritanical, gossipy people, you know, shaming each other for their hemlines in some 19th century church. Like there's still something of that culture beneath the surface in Toronto. And it comes out with the social justice stuff sometimes, but it also has come out a little bit where you have these sometimes often it's like these very wealthy people on Twitter shaming other people for using parks. Uh, I'm lucky. I have a backyard. I live in a leafy area. I can walk my dog. It's nice. I can throw a ball for my dog in the backyard. There's people who don't have backyards and they live in apartment buildings, and the only opportunity they have for green space is to go to a park. And then to have some guy give them a ticket because they're, doing a push-up or something in a park. I mean, it's just insane.
Hmm.
And it's classist because the people who are making the policy, they have plenty of opportunities to use green space. Often they have green space on their own property. So I've quite been opposed to that, and I'm glad to see BC has been an exception to that.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. The idea that, I mean, I guess that's a problem with messaging because I understand why the state inside messaging exists, because it was, early on they're trying to discourage people from congregating, and obviously getting
Right.
together and a lot of people
Early
in
on, it
one
made sense.
space.
I think
But
early on it made sense.
Yeah. And but then of course, going outside is good for your health and good for your mental well-being, and that's a way that you can socialize in all of this and stay healthy, and by going for walks, going to the park with friends, and like I said, in Vancouver we're all at the park sitting around on blankets, and people are keeping their distance. People are pretty respectful.
So, I mean, the analogy I use is like right at the beginning of the pandemic, or at the beginning of our knowledge of the pandemic, um, it made sense to have the strictest interpretation of the rules we had to follow. Like the analogy I use is you drop a glass in the kitchen. The first thing you tell is that everyone needs to stand where you are. You don't know where the glass is, don't move. When you see where the glass is and you isolate that area, then people can start to move around. You don't have to make sure everyone within a 50-foot radius sits exactly where they are. And the problem with some Canadian cities is even as March became April and April became May, they acted as if we were still in that original phase where we knew nothing about the disease. We knew nothing about whether it spread with, fine aerosol droplets, or if you could get it from, a FedEx package, or if it was as contagious as the measles. I mean, it's a very contagious disease, but thank God it's not as contagious as the measles. Measles, if you're unvaccinated, you can get measles if you're in the same room with somebody, because it really does travel the way aerosol droplets do, but it just wafts through the air. That's, for the most part, that's seems to be not how this disease spreads. And we started to understand the science of it in the first couple of weeks, uh, but we kept on with that slogan-based thing. You know, stay at home, do this, do that. When my view is that you have to arm people with the science, and you can't micromanage their behavior all the time, especially now that they're going back to work. You can't put dots in every workplace. And by the way, the 6 foot social distancing thing, my objection to that is 6 feet is neither a necessary nor sufficient condition, depending on context. If you're outside passing someone on the sidewalk, you don't need to be 6 feet apart if they're not sneezing or anything like that. Like glancing social contact in outdoor space is not, you're not going to get the disease. On the other hand, if you're with someone who's sneezing and coughing and symptomatic, 6 feet is not going to save you. Uh, so even this popular slogan about 6 foot social distance, that's inadequate. And we have to start training people on the science so that they can start making their own decisions, because the government can't micromanage every single social and professional interaction that takes place in a country of 35 million people.
Hmm. And so you've been studying the data since the beginning. What is the science? I mean, what would you, if you were in charge and you could decide, what would you be directing everyone to do?
So I'm not sure I would direct anybody to do any one specific. I mean, with some exceptions, like there are certain activities that are unsafe. But the data I've looked at, so my study, my scientific background is in fluid dynamics and thermodynamics, and I've always been very interested in the actual physical, fluid mechanical ways that the disease transmits itself. What is it, through aerosol droplets? Is it through ballistic droplets? Is it through fomites? Is it through this or that? Because our policy response should be dictated by what the main transmission mechanism is. And respiratory diseases can be transmitted in all of those ways and other ways. So I did this. I assumed that somebody internationally had done a study of all the so-called superspreader events around the world and created a database of it. And I looked for that database because I wanted to analyze it along these lines. No one had created this database. And so I created the database myself, drawing primarily on journalistic sources. As I stressed, this is not a scientific grade study, because drawing on editorial sources, I'm beholden to all kinds of editorial biases about what cases got covered and what didn't. But what I found was, I was shocked that I think by now I have almost 100 cases in my database now, because people from around the world, including doctors, started to send me their data. Um, it's a very narrow range of activities that lead to super spreader events. Obviously, spread in prisons, family, residences, hospitals, old age homes. These are the places you would expect, because everyone's in close contact. Population density is high. There's all kinds of infected surfaces, and people are coughing and sneezing and spitting, and it's. But if you look outside those areas, I found that there was a huge cluster of super spreading events. They always seem to involve the same set of activities. It will always socially promiscuous, high density gatherings, typically where people are in some kind of agitated state. They're either at a funeral, they're grieving, sobbing, hugging up in each other's faces, dancing. Concerts were very well represented, singing clubs, meatpacking plants, cruise ships, funerals, as I said, parties, festivals, uh, and religious gatherings. But it was interesting. It was a very specific kind of religious activity. It tended to be missionary work or evangelical churches or religious festivals where there was a lot of very tight emotional mingling between people and a lot of face-to-face contact. And when I looked at all of this, and I explained this at some length in this article that I wrote, the pattern is consistent with a disease that spreads primarily. We don't know. I make no pretense of saying, oh, this is the only way the disease transmits, but at least in these super spreader events, it's primarily close range, face to face contact between with an infected, agitated individual speaking, singing, yelling, cheering, very high velocity of breath, large droplets being transmitted from one face directly to another face ballistically. That seems to be the major transmission mechanism of this disease. And yet, despite the fact that I think we should know this, I mean, it's there in the data, I still have friends, educated people who like they'll get a package from the mailman and they'll leave it in their front porch for a week because they think that what, like some germ's going to jump up and go down their throat and infect them. And that's, at first I washed stuff down with bleach 2 months ago. I had no idea. I hadn't looked at the data. I was like everybody else. I was bleach this, bleach that. My kids everyone was getting bleached. Like it was just, I bleached my hair at one point, and it was that's another subject, I guess. But those days are over. So if I were a public health official, which by the way I should never be because I have no formal public health training, I would tell people all this. I wouldn't give them just slogans. I would give them the science. I would say, look, this is what we know about how the disease transmits. I'm not, in my theoretical role as a public health official, I'd say the government can't be with you in your workplace every day. We can't be with you at the post office. We can't be with you at the supermarket. We're not going to govern your life with dots. This is how the disease transmits. If you're going to walk around in public, if you're going to work with people, assume that people are going to sneeze, assume they're going to cough, assume that they're going to breathe heavily, assume, they're going to say hello to you. Conduct yourself in a way that even if that person is sneezing or coughing, that you're not going to get infected from them. So if that means you're going to 10 feet away, 15 feet away, if that means you're wearing a mask, which I think in most cases, in a lot of these contexts, people should wear masks, yeah, you should be doing that. But it also means like there are certain contexts that you cannot ever protect yourself, like bars, mass participation sports events. Curling is one example that was in my database because if you've ever seen people curl, their like faces are 6 inches from each other while they're sweeping the ice. There was a major super spreader event in I think it was Edmonton, involving a bunch of middle-aged doctors who were there for a conference. Curling is purpose designed, it seems, for spreading this disease. Um, and so if I were a premier, I would ban those activities for the foreseeable future. But I would explain why I'm banning them. I wouldn't say, I'm banning this and not banning that. Say the reason we're banning this is because the science of the way the disease transmits, this kind of activity cannot be done safely. And it's actually a fairly narrow range of activities that can't be done safely. Like, sorry, I'm prattling on here, but like in Nova Scotia, after that horrible mass murder a couple weeks ago, the province of Nova Scotia, they limited the funerals of the victims to 5 attendees. This is ridiculous because it isn't the size of the funeral that matters. You could have 5 attendees at a funeral acting in a medically unsafe way. You could have 1,000 people at the funeral. If they're spaced out and acting responsibly, that could be perfectly safe. I thought it was ridiculous that they were focusing on the size, as if it's like there's some magical medical minion that gets created and everyone spreads the disease. That's not the way it works. So I think there's been a lot of like very simplistic sloganeering around policy response. The first thing I would do if it were up to me is I would get rid of all that and focus on the behavior and not on slogans and rules and arbitrary limits.
Hmm. And do you have any ideas around where this originated? Of course, there's the wet markets issue, and then there's been speculation about it being leaked from some lab in Wuhan, and a bunch of other things that are, conspiracy theories, of course.
So yeah, the leading theory now, which is also the leading theory 2 months ago, was that this was originally a virus, a so-called reservoir virus in bats. And I say reservoir virus because bats, like fish and certain other creatures, have what are known as reservoir viruses, meaning like they go through their whole life cycle with viruses. This is different from humans. Humans don't just have viruses in their system on an everyday basis. When we have a virus, it typically means we're sick. A bat, like as I say, like a fish is, fish often will have a perfectly healthy fish that we eat often will have multiple viruses. It's just part of the life cycle of a fish or a bat. So this is thought to have been a virus contained, a reservoir virus contained in a bat that mutated and made the jump to humans, possibly through a creature called a pangolin, which is basically a giant fingernail. And one basis for speculation was that, as I understand, pangolins are chopped up and eaten in China. One of the delightful customs in China is that it feels like they'll eat anything to give themselves an erection or something like that. It's just, unfortunately, there's a whole bunch of endangered creatures around the world that are sold in Chinese markets as bogus sex cures and other forms of New Age medicine. It's quite sad, actually. Um, but the pangolins might have been a conduit for this reservoir virus from bats, but I think actually the latest literature suggests that probably wasn't the case. The idea that this virus escaped from a lab, like it's not completely impossible. All sorts of nations have researched viruses and biological weapons and that sort of thing for decades, including the United States. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that there was an accidental release of some kind of virus from a laboratory, although I've seen no evidence to suggest that uh, this was the reason it happened. The idea that it was intentionally released from a lab, that to me brings us into the realm of complete conspiracy theory. And, uh, you know, if I'm in a Twitter conversation and someone starts going on about that, it's usually time to leave. Is unless I see evidence to the contrary in the next few weeks or months, to me that's just in the realm of conspiracy theory.
Yeah. What do you think about I mean, do you think that this whole thing has bolstered or encouraged racism against Chinese
No,
people?
no. Well, look. Okay, so human beings are racist. I mean, they just are. Their tribalism is bred into our evolutionary psychology, and we often don't need that much encouragement to be racists. Thankfully, in Canada and other Western countries, well, most countries, in fact, racism is often pretty benign, although sometimes it does reach the level of a real social problem or even violence or murder. There are hate crimes. The kind of racism you've seen against Chinese people in Canada, you've seen graffiti and there were people who started boycotting Chinese restaurants. But it's kind of complicated because, like, the people I know in Toronto who boycotted Chinese restaurants were Chinese people. I remember there was someone who was Filipino who was saying, "Yeah, until this thing's over, I'm only going to Filipino restaurants. I'm not going to Chinese restaurants because, And then he recited a lot of data about, the infection rates in certain parts of China. Like it's not as if it was educated racism. It wasn't uneducated racism. And so I'm very wary of people who are making broad generalizations about Canadians being racists. Um, I grew up in Quebec, and during the AIDS crisis, there was a lot of real racism against Haitians and blacks in general around the issue of AIDS, and that was much worse than what we've seen against Chinese people in 2020. And both are reprehensible, but I think the amount of racism that the Chinese community has had to endure, well, it's obviously it's bad. I don't think it compares in terms of the actual damage that's been done to human health and to the economy. And I think it's a very Canadian response. I think it's a laudable response, a laudable reflex that one of the first things our government did was make sure nobody was being racist. But honestly, I think even many Chinese people in Canada would say, stop rubbing your hands and worrying about racism. Like let's make sure people don't die, right?
I mean, it's funny because early on, a lot of people predicted that whatever you want to call it, woke politics, cancel culture, social justice warrior, politically correct stuff. That's mostly centered online, so therefore represents a minority of very loud people. Um, they sort of predicted that would take a back seat because there was a global pandemic. And I think that actually the opposite has happened. And, we've seen, I don't know if you followed all this. I wrote an article about it that ended up being quite controversial. There was a guy who worked as an art director for Lululemon who shared a link to a design that I believe a friend of his made. Did you hear about all this? It
No,
was, oh, okay.
tell me about
I'll
it.
try to, okay, I'll try to explain it. This artist in LA made this kind of jokey design, and it had an image of a Chinese takeout box on it, and then some little bat wings over here, and then it said no thank you. And he wasn't, it wasn't some big company. He's just
Right.
an independent artist. He wasn't trying to like make it. He was like, I'm
Yeah.
selling this t-shirt design, and he kind of made a joke under the post on Instagram saying, we don't know where this came from, but we know there was a bat involved. And then he was like, if you want this shirt, I'm selling it for $60. It was never even produced. The guy who worked for Lululemon linked, he didn't even post about it. He just put a link in his private Instagram account. And Twitter caught on to this somehow, and it turned into a massive mob who went after him. It was all over the media. It was covered in American media. It was in the New York Times.
Okay.
He of course his name is destroyed across the internet because he's a racist for sharing this link. He was fired from his job. I wrote an article saying this is ridiculous. This doesn't do anything to challenge racism. And obviously, I'm very critical of cancel culture, which is what this is. There's no conversation, there's no understanding, there's just knee jerking. So things like that, and people are online even more than ever, and I think funneling their anxiety into the internet and spending all their time arguing on the internet, like it seems like people are even more caught up in their
So
ideological bubbles.
yeah, so I hadn't heard of that case, which is surprising because I consider myself an aficionado of these teapot tempests, and I'm gonna have to go back and read your column about it. It might be the case now that you're seeing a lot of social justice nonsense like this. I think in the first few weeks, or even the first maybe 6 weeks of this crisis, I definitely saw less social justice stuff because a lot of the social justice Puritans were being Puritans about the lockdown. And I feel like you can only be a Puritan about one thing at once. Like it's very confusing if you're, a diet Puritan and a religious Puritan and a health Puritan and a justice Puritan. Like it's felt like a lot of the puritanical energy that used to go into policing pronouns and stuff was suddenly going into like, my neighbor is having a barbecue. Here's a photo, get him fired. So it was sort of like cancel culture, but as applied to COVID-19. Um, but lately, I've seen it blurring together. Like, uh, I'll give you an example. I've heard in Montreal, and I'm sure it's happening here in Toronto, where some of these parenting groups on Facebook. Facebook is a service that old people like me use. We There'll be like a parent group, and a parent will say, "Oh, I hear schools are opening next week. I was thinking of sending my kids. What do you guys think?" And like, it's just bedlam. People are like, "Oh, sure. If you want to kill your kids, is that what you want? Are you a good parent? Should I call child services?" And uh, people get their backs up because they become very defensive of their position. And then the argument becomes, well, okay, it's fine for you to keep your kid home because, you're a stay-at-home dad or a stay-at-home mom and you have all the time in the world to maybe to homeschool your kid while your spouse works. But I'm in a family where we're not able to do that. We don't have the means to do it, and we live in an apartment, and we want our kids to go to school. And then it becomes a class-based conversation. So I have seen some of that. And by the way, the dynamic is somewhat similar in that sometimes the most puritanical people are like the upper middle class privileged people who are have all the hashtags about, stay inside, stay safe, all this, and they're judging working class people who don't have the same option set. So some of the dynamics are the same, but there's certain things I've just seen a lot less of. Like I've seen a lot less of the gender cultism. And in fact, there were a couple of publications, um, forget which. Actually, I think one was NBC maybe, who it was, you know, um, COVID-19 is terrible. It's especially terrible if you're a trans person. And there were a couple like that, and they just got like massively ratioed. People were like, and even trans people were like, look, being trans is tough. I face challenges, but this is not the time for us to fixate on this. And so I have seen people actually retreat from some of the more cultish social justice stuff during this time, but I'm sure that'll change, and probably already is changing. The example you just cited, the Lululemon guy, suggests we're snapping back into our usual pattern of tearing each other up over nothing instead of tearing each other up over COVID-19.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I guess the difference with that case is, and then the consequent attacks on me, um, is that it is related to COVID-19 in that the design was related to COVID, and people are really taking up racism as it's connected in their minds to COVID and fighting that. So they're
Right.
taking their social justice inclinations and connecting it. I mean, because yeah, it does seem inappropriate to be writing hot takes about how it's really hard for trans people who had, cosmetic
But people
surgery
tried that.
scheduled. They
People
did.
tried that.
They
And it
did.
was and it was
It was
hilariously
amusing.
bad. But what was so pathetic was I read two articles. They were virtually identical articles, but in neither case were they able to actually find a trans person who had COVID-19. So like you could you could tell they like were looking for one, and so they couldn't. So instead, it was just like, yeah, even if you don't have COVID-19, it just sucks because everyone's so transphobic and stuff. And maybe you could run that article now. Maybe people are like back to their usual obsession, so you could run it. But one example I wanted to cite, which I thought was so pathetic, was from before the pandemic was declared. This is, I think, maybe like February. It was Queen's University. These frat dudes had it's so funny. Well, it's stupid, but it's this is before people were dying, except in China, and so they had a Corona party where they were serving Corona beers,
Right.
and it was like no more or less stupid than like your average frat party, right? Instead of having like an Irish wake or a wet t-shirt contest, they were making fun of this horrible disease. Um, and the Queen's University, being a Canadian university, caught wind of it, and they put out like a succession of press releases about how disgusted they were, and not accusing them of racism, but saying, we take racism very seriously. If anyone's been affected by racism, let us know. Like, they clearly couldn't nail these guys for racism because it's not like they had the flying chow mein box like on that t-shirt you're describing. It was more just like some guy was like, hey, Corona, that's the name of a beer. That's our poster. Like, it was that level of thinking. But still, the school, the entire school brain trust spent the week sending out press releases about how they weren't racists. Um, and I'm not even sure if the fraternity got disciplined, but it turned into a major thing, despite the fact there was not a single piece of evidence that any of it was motivated by racism. It was just pure male college stupidity.
Right. Um, I wonder, I wanted to ask you earlier when you were talking about the science around social distancing, do you think then that so when you go to the grocery store or the liquor store in BC, I'm sure it's the same in Ontario, they have those little dots where you
Yep.
stand. When you wait in line, you have to wait here, blah, blah, blah. Do you think that is to calm people's anxiety, or do you think that's actually useful in that circumstance?
So, at places like that, those dots started being painted on, I guess maybe late March, early April. I don't think it was a bad idea because, especially at the beginning, as I said, you need some baseline of call it sloganeering or simple rules. Like at first, people need social rules and they're comforted by it. Like a lot of the anxiety people have is the anxiety that, like, well, I'm following the rules, but what if my neighbor doesn't? And if your neighbor doesn't, not only is your neighbor putting you in danger, but you might have to like confront them. And the nice thing about the dot is at least it sets, even if it's an arbitrary baseline, and as I said, it's neither a necessary nor sufficient way to stop the spread of the disease, depending on circumstances. At least it gives some basis so that if you're there, you don't have this resentment that some people do get that says, I'm doing my part, but that those idiots aren't doing their part. And you do see that. And if there's dots and people aren't standing on the dot, you have some basis to say, it's easier to say to a person, hey, do you mind getting on the dot if you're a staff member, as opposed to, hey, do you mind not acting like an idiot? Because if people are given a specific instruction, like stand on the dot, it feels less personal than if someone comes to them and says, I don't like the way you're behaving. That's like a more personal, higher stakes kind of discussion, and that's when people get into arguments. Um, but the liquor store thing drives me nuts because I mean here in Toronto over the weekend, you couldn't go to High Park, which is one of our biggest parks, to see the cherry blossoms, but you could go get loaded at the liquor store. Like you could go to the liquor store and line up and buy booze, even though you could also have the booze delivered to your house. But it was like the Ontario government said, liquor stores are an essential service, but people can't go see the cherry blossoms in an outdoor park because no, that's too dangerous. I actually supported keeping the liquor stores open because I'd see people wanted their booze so much they were acting responsibly. They were terrified of getting thrown out of the liquor store. But if you're going to sell liquor to people, let them into the park. Like 20 years from now, I'm going to be telling my grandkids, like, yeah, in 2020, we let people buy liquor, but we wouldn't let them go to the park, even though half our society is obese. Like, it's really just a weird public health message.
I mean, I'm grateful to be able to go to the liquor store, so
I'm glad
I'm also grateful to be able to go to the park.
but no, but you know what? I have these arguments on Twitter, and people are like, "Oh, you teetotaler, like you don't want anyone to have a good time. You want to close the liquor stores down." I'm like, no, actually, I'm making the opposite argument. I think it's fine. The liquor store. I have been to the liquor store, um, but if we all decide we're all on board with the fact that the liquor store should stay open, then we should also be on board with the fact that we can go look at a cherry blossom tree without suddenly like making out with each other or something. Like we're adults, if we can buy liquor, it means we could look at a tree. And that's one of the things, it was the double standard that, because by the way, the cherry blossom trees don't make money for the Ontario government. The LCBO, and I'm sure you have the equivalent in BC, it makes millions of dollars a day for the government. So of course, but the Ontario government lined up a bunch of doctors who said, "Oh yes, essential service. If we don't keep these liquor stores open, all these alcoholics are going to be lining our emergency rooms," which is ridiculous because the LCBO delivers, and you can actually buy closed bottles of wine from restaurants. You can buy them from the grocery stores. The whole thing was so cynical.
I mean, it's
But like I
also,
said,
sorry.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say it also is a little bit amusing because it sort of seems like I'm funneling my money to the liquor store and then back to myself. Do you know, like people are going to the liquor store and spending money at the liquor
Right.
store and then they're getting a check from the provincial government.
It's kind of it's the compromise we endure for living in a civilized societies that when we gas up, booze up, smoke up, use public highways, there are ways to pay back the government. I don't mind it.
Oh no, I'm happy to. I'm happy
Yeah,
to pay taxes.
I,
I want to support the government. I want to have
yeah,
public services. Totally.
I want to be a good Canadian, but I want to look at a cherry blossom too. Like they're pretty.
Yeah, they are pretty. I mean, I have cherry blossoms right all behind my apartment. Every time I go for a walk with my dog, I can see them everywhere. So maybe you're just living in the wrong province.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is kind of a role reversal because Vancouver is so ideologically crazy in so many ways, but it sounds like in this very important thing, they've actually kept their head in a way that some other cities like Toronto and certainly Ottawa have not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm prejudiced for and against Vancouver in many ways. Um, but what do you think is next? I mean, there's some There's speculation, for example, that we'll open things up and then there'll be another wave in the fall and we'll have to shut things down again. There's speculation around whether, when we'll get a vaccine, and then if we do get a vaccine, whether that will even work and be effective, or if it's that, we'll need some kind of antivirals, or if we need herd immunity. I don't know what your thoughts are on all of that.
Well, so vaccines are, we all want a vaccine. I think the typical production cycle in a vaccine is 18 months, but there's been all these reports that say, well, that 18 months includes all these bureaucratic steps that uh, obviously we're going to accelerate, so it might take 6 months. But like most of the people watching this, I've had a flu shot, and one of the things they tell you when you get the flu shot is they'll say like this flu shot is 30% effective or 40% effective. When viruses can be tricky things, and we've been lucky that some of the worst viruses have succumbed, are vulnerable to vaccines like measles, and we've eradicated smallpox and stuff like that. Um, but it may be the case that we have a virus and it's only like 30% effective, 40% effective, which will obviously help for so-called herd immunity. That's when the number of vulnerable people, the number of contagious people, it becomes such a small proportion that due to the exponential arithmetic of disease propagation, the whole society becomes relatively safe because so many people are either immune or they've had it or whatnot. Uh, in my view, I'm skeptical of the idea that when the fall comes, the disease is going to become racing back because so many of the habits we've developed are sticky. And when I say sticky, I mean it isn't just a question of government mandate. It isn't just a question of we're doing it because it's the law. In some cases, the actual architecture of our physical spaces has changed. Like there's a pastry shop in my neighborhood that stayed open. It's a Greek pastry shop. And it was like this neighborhood place where, all these people were like, "Oh, nice to see you," pinching kids' cheeks. Like it was like out of a Norman Rockwell painting. And now you go in and it's a different place. The people are still there. It's busy. They're friendly. There are dots on the floor, but there are big plastic barriers between you and the woman at the cash register. And when you pay, you tap your card. I don't see anyone using cash anymore. I mean, obviously, very few people were using cash before, but there's a lot of places that just won't take cash. And in many cases, it's not the government that said you can't take cash. It's the employers who made this decision. Uh, and these plastic walls, these dots, these habits of mind, someone sneezes and everyone like looks and instead of 6 feet away, suddenly we're 20 feet away. That's not going to change. It's not like, June's going to become July and we're going to get September and we're going to forget all this. I think these are going to be very sticky. And I think both sides of the lockdown debate overstate the role of government. I think maybe not most, well, in some cases, actually, yeah, most of the suppression of the disease has come from individual people making behavioral decisions. Uh, Many employers I know sent their people home from offices well before the government made them do it. If you look at public transit data from around the world, you look at public transit usage plunged all around the world around the same time in mid-March, despite the fact that some of these transit systems were subject to lockdowns and some weren't. And if you look at graphs like that, it makes me skeptical of the idea that a formal lockdown was really what caused people to stop giving each other the disease. It was a lockdown in our minds in some ways, but it also makes me very skeptical that an absence of a lockdown will suddenly cause this flourishing of the disease, which, seasonally, yes, these viruses do tend to come back as the weather gets colder in the fall. I'm sure we'll see an upward blip. I'm very skeptical that we'll see like the calamitous exponential rise of the disease in the same way we saw in February, March, and April. I don't think that's going to happen because our behaviors, the architecture of our public spaces are sticky. And also like the sort of mass events where these things happen. In Europe, a lot of these events were like soccer games where there were 50,000 people, rugby games, concerts where there were 30,000 people. Those things, I mean, even in the fall, those things are not going to be happening. So yeah, some guy might have a barbecue with 5 or 10 people, and 2 or 3 of them get sick. But by that time, we're going to have way better contact tracing, and we're going to have way better. Even if we don't have a vaccine, we're going to have more testing. So some of the worst outbreaks occurred in places like sorry, in Korea, where that this notorious, her name was Patient 31. She infected dozens or even hundreds of people. The reason she was able to infect all those people is she was never tested until it was too late. That's not going to happen. If someone's sneezing and coughing and comes into a hospital, and she went to several hospitals, if I remember correctly. It's not like they're going to say, "Oh yeah, go home and yeah, go to your kid's birthday party tomorrow." Like it's instead of that person infecting 100 people, they're going to infect like two. And so the exponential rise is going to be much more suppressed. I'm very skeptical of people who draw these graphs. The researchers at Imperial College in London drew these very scary graphs showing about how the disease was going to come roaring back in the fall. But I looked at their data and I looked at their model. Their model suggested that as soon as the lockdown ended, the next day, people's behavior would revert to what it was in December 2019. That's insane. Of course, that's not going to happen. Uh, yes, over months and years, our behavior is going to go back to the baseline. But actually, it might never go back to a baseline. Like all this study I've been doing about droplets and sneezing and coughing and the amount of flu, it's disgusting. Like I look back at the way I behaved and the way everybody behaves. Um, like humans are gross. Like it's just there was all sorts of behaviors that I don't think in my lifetime I'll ever feel comfortable doing again. You look at these videos of that I talked about Bergamo, Italy. A huge portion of the population became infected at this notorious soccer game, February 19th at San Siro Stadium in Milan, where the local team was playing Valencia. And you look at the video of the fans, which I did for my research, and like total strangers, like just screaming in each other's faces, like every time a goal was scored or a penalty kick, like inches from each other's face, and you could see the spittle flying in all directions. And even putting aside COVID-19, you don't have to be a germaphobe to say like we probably just shouldn't be doing that. It's just probably not healthy behavior. So I don't think that's going to change. I don't, I've heard people say they can't even watch old movies or TV shows because they'll see some scene where some guy's sick and he comes to a party and it's like you can't even watch it. It's like, oh my God, if someone did that now, um, wow, their social media ostracism would be like 100 Megan Murphys. It's like
Harsh.
the has become the international unit of measure of of social
Cancellation.
media anger. Like register 100 MMs on. No, it'd be so yeah. So I
I
don't think our behavior will ever go back to what it was.
I know. I mean, it's really reinforced one of my like major pet peeves back when I used to work in offices or, when I was in school even was people coming into work when they were sick, when they had sick days. I'm not necessarily, I mean, everyone should have sick days so that they don't feel pressured to come to work if they're ill. But, like I've worked in office environments that were unionized and we all had lots and lots of sick days and these people showing up coughing and sneezing. And
Yeah.
I would just be like enraged because I was like, you're not that important. You don't really need to be here. You have a
See,
sick day. We're in this
I,
confined space. We're all in these cubicles. Like,
yeah. I wish I could say I was like you, but I wasn't. I was one of those guys who my last office job, and even when I was at school, especially when I was at McGill, that it was I saw it as like this macho thing, like I'm sick, but I haven't taken a sick day in 4 years, and I'm not going to start now.
that's
And that was
you.
stupid. That was stupid. No, I was that guy. Now, I think when you're younger, like when I was a teenager, I mean, teenagers think they're immortal. And a lot of people in my neighborhood, they'll see these teenagers in the park, they're not social distancing, and they're like, "Oh my God, those teenagers, we should do something." I'm like, "Well, do you remember what you were like when you were a teenager? Like, I thought I was going to live to be a million, and I did some stupid stuff, and I didn't wear a seatbelt. And I'm not saying that was good; it was stupid. But if you tell those kids not to social distance, they'll scream at you and they'll walk a block and they'll continue to not social distance. Like human nature is what it is. People like us are mature and responsible, and some people aren't.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
always.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder if you think that society will be changed forever as a result of this. I mean, I sort of think that we will get back to normal at some point. I don't know when, but people always get mad at me when I say that we're going to get back to normal, either because they say, we don't want normal, normal's terrible. And I'm like, normal is okay.
Right.
But also, I do think that there's going to be any kind of widespread changes, both in terms of how we interact with one another, but in terms of industry, business, the economy,
Right.
maybe other
Uh,
things like
yeah.
public health, things
So
like universal basic income, all of these things.
uh, that's a really good question, and especially that last part you talked about UBI, and there's a lot of economists, and including a surprisingly large number of conservatives, who are sympathetic to universal basic income, especially if it replaces, the hundred other sometimes contradictory income support programs that exist. And what the government is now doing, at least in Canada, is something like a UBI. It's in a crisis situation. It's not meant to last forever. So it is possible that there will be a welcome, perhaps unintended, public policy experiment in the way we help people with income support. We are actually starting to run a series at Quillette on the way the world's going to be changed by this. And our first essay, which will be published soon, is really interesting. The woman argues, she says, right now, if you say to somebody, well, not now, but like 6 months ago, if you said to somebody, oh my God, what a crazy day, I never left the house, that was seen as weird. And she said that the world is going to change as a result of this pandemic in a way that's not going to feel weird, because the pandemic has taught us that Uber Eats can deliver your food and Amazon can deliver your stuff, and your kids might be able to educate themselves at home. You might be able to work from home. It's not going to feel weird to not leave your house. People are going to get more Peloton bikes. They're going to find more ways to be self-sufficient at home. And she had a very expansive theory. There's going to be more people who get their university education online. I mean, that's something that started already. There were a lot of people who were like, you know what? I don't need to spend 3 years and $80,000 studying computer science. There are YouTube there, and this is true. There are YouTube videos that will teach me how to program in Python or Java, and 100 other languages. And she said that we are going to become homebodies. We're going to become, and when we interview for jobs, right now when you interview for a job, you might say, um, you might negotiate with your employer and say, can I work from home 2 days a week? She says that it's going to be the opposite, that the expectation in jobs is you're going to work from home, and your employer will have to negotiate with you and say, can you come into the office 2 days a week? Now, I don't know if that's true, but it's interesting. And I do, I've met older people who survived World War II. This is not World War II, but World War II, tens of millions of people died. Um, COVID-19, hundreds of thousands of people died, but it's not World War II. But, it's interesting, the habits people get into stay with them their whole life. Like, you meet people who are rich or wealthy who survived the rationing from World War II era and the years after, because in Britain the rationing lasts for years after, and you'll still see the way they use sugar or butter or eggs, and like the way they have them lined up, or they'll get really nervous if you take some of their sugar, and they'll say, I'm sorry, but I have these instant, like, I went through rationing after World War II, and so I'm just like, that part of me will never change. It doesn't matter how much money I have or how comfortable I am. Like, it changed the way they think. Now, rationing lasted for years, and World War II was on a scale of suffering way beyond COVID-19. But it's an example that shows that even decades after a major event happens, you can still see the residue in people's psychology. And I think you will see the residue in our psychology. People like you and me, I think 10 years from now, the way we interact with the other people, our attitude toward germs and disease, I think it'll change. I think it'll be different.
Hmm. And what about travel? I mean, I even, I've traveled a lot this year, and I'm really grateful for that, mostly for work, but it was still great, especially because this has happened now, and who knows when I'll be able to travel again. But it's always been unnerving being stuck on a plane with a bunch of, there's always people coughing on the plane.
Yeah.
And it's always really stressful to me because I'm like, and
Well,
now,
my
like, geez.
my theory is So my theory is based on my research. The plane, there actually aren't that many super spreader events for this disease on planes, and part of the reason is on planes, you've got your back to people. It's unless you've got sitting next to a close talker, you're probably not going to have someone up in your face the whole flight. And now, by the way, you have a great excuse not to talk to a close talker because they're like, "Oh, where are you going?" You're like, "Fuck yourself," like I don't want your
Keep your
germs.
COVID away from me.
Yeah, flight attendant, kick this person off the plane. So, ironically, like, have you ever been on those trains where you've got the banquettes facing each other and you're facing a stranger? Because some via rail cars, at least in Eastern Canada.
I've never
Yeah.
been on one before.
Well, in Eastern Canada, at least, they still have them, and that's actually dangerous because then you're face to face. The other thing is what happens when you get to your destination, the activities like trade show. I mean, a lot of travel is for face to face sales meetings, trade shows, business conferences. Those were some of the places where some of these massive super spreaders I studied took place. And that's because what happens at a trade show? You're like, oh, what business are you in? Give me your business card. Let's talk. And you're face to face. And then 30 seconds later, you're talking to another person. They're tailor made to spread the disease. Those kinds of things, I think, for years, they're not going to take place. So there's going to be a lot less travel because client meetings are going to be done by Zoom. A lot of older people, 70, 80-year-olds who aren't comfortable with computers, but like, Passover Seders. I know Jewish grandparents who they learned Zoom because they wanted to do a video Passover Seder with their grandkids. And they're not going to forget how to do Zoom when the crisis is over. Like that technology is here to stay for 8-year-olds and for 80-year-olds. The other thing is I couldn't I couldn't help but remember. So do you remember you came to Toronto to speak at like this library event? You probably, you probably
Barely,
don't
vaguely.
remember because it's a library, so it's kind of boring. But so you spoke at the library, and you probably don't know this, but while you were speaking, there was all these protesters outside,
Right.
and well,
How was
actually,
that noise?
yeah, I remember it as being fun because I didn't go to the protest, but we had drinks after, and it was a blast. And then we did something similar in Vancouver. But if you remember, well, of course you remember, but when everyone was coming out of that event you did at the library in late 2019, you had a bunch of women coming out of the event, and all these people, like 6 inches from their face, screaming at them. Now, this was before COVID-19. I'm not alleging that anti-turf screaming is what caused this disease.
Who could say for sure?
Yeah, right. I did not see any pangolins or bats. But like putting aside the politics and the unsettling rage and craziness of the people who were there to shriek at women, which they thought was a wonderful blow for social justice, that kind of thing just wouldn't happen now because you can't go up to people and scream in their face,
Mm.
no matter what you're screaming. Like, so a lot of the people who are, traveling to Washington to protest this or protest that, a lot of students who are having big rallies, climate change meetups. Sometimes the more successful the rally, the more people are screaming and yelling and getting riled up. Well, guess what? That's dangerous. Um, and the same with sports events. Like I tell people, one of the most dangerous things you can do now at a sports event is sing the national anthem because singing is linked to some of these super spreader events. And the joke, the joke I told, which made me very unpopular here in the city I live in, as I said, uh, you can't cheering for a successful sports team that scores a lot of goals is really dangerous. That's why the only games you should be allowed to see are Toronto Maple Leafs games, which people got mad at me for a
It's a
variety of
very
reasons.
you
But
joke.
but but it's true that like the better your team, the more you're screaming. Like that's what people seek when they go to public events. They
Right.
want to lose their minds. They want to scream. They want to high five strangers. I was at the Toronto Blue Jays game a couple of years ago, where Jose Bautista, I mean, I know what a sports fan you are, where Jose Bautista hit that massive home run to left field against the Texas Rangers in the divisional play. You remember? I mean, I'm sure you could recall. But I
One of the
remember
great moments of my life.
I know, but so I know this means nothing to you, because when it comes to baseball, you're dead inside. But at that moment, like I lost my mind. I was like high-fiving people and we were hugging and probably singing La Marseillaise. Like, I mean, we were just going nuts. And I remember that as a great time. And I won't be able to do anything like that for the foreseeable future. Like, the only way I would enjoy going to a baseball game now is if no one talked or said anything or cheered or booed. And that's probably not like a popular way to watch a sports event. But right now, that's the only safe way to watch a sports event. It's weird. We live in weird times.
Mm. So, I
You
mean,
really that baseball game at all? The game I'm
I've never
describing?
seen a baseball game in my life, I don't think. No, that's not true. That's not true. I've been to like Nat Bailey Stadium to see the Canadians, but like to be fair, I didn't watch or understand the baseball game. I just like had drinks and chatted with my friends and was like, ah.
That's dangerous.
I
Yeah.
I mean, people were not as excited at those games as they probably were at this whatever game it was. I can't even remember anymore what
You
we were
know,
saying.
actually, so I was just talking to a friend of mine from San Francisco, and this is so pathetic. His friends all got sick at a Celine Dion concert, and I'm like,
Maybe that
what a
was like a lesson.
what a way to get sick. Like,
Yeah, was it worth
I
it?
mean, I think Celine Dion is medically contraindicated even before the pandemic. Like, it was just, I can't. And then for years having to tell people, yeah, I got sick, like not at some wet market, but like cheering for Celine Dion.
Odd. I
That
mean, yeah, I can't relate. I can't relate. I was supposed to go to see the Stones like next week.
it's a cool way to get COVID-19.
I mean, I don't think it's gonna happen.
Right. But those people who got at Celine Dion like 5 years from now, the story I would tell would not involve Celine Dion. It would
No.
involve the Stones.
Like who
Yeah,
knows? I don't know. I
yeah.
mean, so do you think that I guess it sounds like travel let me actually ask you instead of guessing because I have no real idea or expertise in this area. Do you think that travel and tourism will recover?
So I think travel may recover because the nice thing about travel is you have choke points. So like when you pass through an airport, it's a heavily documented act. If you're going to another country, you typically need a passport. And countries can require any documentation they want. You know, say, well, you need a COVID-19 test, you need this, you need that. Step right over here. We're going to inspect you. We're going to take your temperature. Like that's the advantage of travel. And the disadvantage of travel is you could spread disease across the world very quickly. The advantage of travel is there's choke points, and authorities can regulate who gets on planes and who doesn't. It also makes contact tracing very easy because you have passenger manifests from planes, and so if someone gets sick in Cincinnati a year from now, when hopefully the disease is very rare, you know, you can trace which passenger it was from which destination and so forth. So I do think the air travel, there's too much money at stake to keep the air travel industry underwater for too long. Um, uh, but again, it's where are people going? Like when I travel, I travel for business sometimes, but a lot of times I travel to go to board game tournaments. And board game tournaments are exactly the kind of thing that are going to be banned for a couple of years. Like two dudes sitting 12 inches from each other for like 8 hours across a table, arguing, yelling, you know,
Screaming, spitting in each other's
yeah,
faces.
I try and avoid the screaming, but so I have a confession to make is I went to a board game tournament in late February and early March in Copenhagen. And we were in a small airless room. There were people from like a dozen different countries. This was late February, early March. I got lucky, but like we were in that room for like 16-hour days for like 3 or 4 days straight. We were just asking for it. And when I look
And
back at
maybe
that,
even deserved it, considering.
I think I would have deserved it. And I remember there's this guy from Spain, of all places, who like even after the tournament, we hung around and spent 4 or 5 hours just playing for fun. And and I remember he's a super nice guy, but also very like stereotypically like emotive and expressive. And um, I'm shocked I didn't get sick, but none of us got sick. Like I followed up, and we just got lucky. But there's I don't think we'll be able to do it next year, even like unless they find 100% vaccine. This is one of the great joys of my life is going to these places, and you know these are my friends and playing this tournament, and I'm not going to be able to do it. The Canadian squad leader. So the game I play is called Squad Leader. Or it's called Advanced Squad Leader. I'm sure you've played it while you're at the baseball game.
I'm like
And
trying hard not to laugh throughout this whole thing, and
okay,
I feel bad
I,
because I know you really
you know
love
what?
it.
Okay, But no, but it's a subculture. Everyone has their subculture. This is my subculture. So substitute it. If you're watching this, substitute it for knitting or watching some British
Going
mystery
to
or
rap
whatever.
shows,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
socializing with friends
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
bar, things that normal
Actual
people do.
fun, right? Okay. So yeah. So there's this game called it's called Advanced Squad Leader (ASL), and the tournament was supposed to be in Fredericton in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now. Uh, and instead, we are having a computer tournament where we're going to play the game over the internet. And we're going to have this big Zoom meeting where all 32 of us meet, or house party, or whatever people are using a month from now. And it's going to be fun, but it's also going to be sad because part of the fun is you get together in a room and you hang out. And some of these guys are older. Like I'm in the bloom of youth, right? And I'm 51, but some of these guys are, they're in their 70s and stuff. And I don't know how many more tournaments they're going to be going to. And it it's nice that we're doing the digital tournament. It's better than nothing. But my hobby has been hit pretty hard. And I think if you're in music, anything to do with music, concerts, live performances, um, you know, there are a lot of bands. Bands, unless you're a huge recording star, most of your money often is just coming from playing small gigs in bars or clubs, and that's gone. Like,
Yeah.
and maybe your side hustle, maybe you're a waiter or a barista, that's gone too. So you're 28 and living back with your parents. Like these are tough times. So
Totally. And I mean, the replacing those kinds of events and any social event at all, conferences, panels, board game tournaments, anything, it's not at all replaced by doing it online. I hate doing these like Zoom social chats, and it, like, I guess it helps a bit temporarily, but it's not the same in any way at all, and it's kind of exhausting, and I'm not that into
so
it.
well, it's interesting. I'm wondering what your viewers think about that because I agree with you that like you get 10 people on a Zoom call and it's like it can become chaotic, and I'm sort of an introvert anyway, so I'm like, well, I don't even really like doing this in real life, so this is kind of I don't like this. But I do like Zoom if it's with one person and it's somebody I already know, like it's, I'm not on chat roulette or something like that. And it's and we're doing an activity like we're playing board games as an example. So there's a guy named Mike here in Toronto, and there's a game called Command and Colors that we both love, and it's a game that happens to apply itself really well digitally. So it's a board game, and he's a guy I've known from high school, and when we play it, it's actually like fairly similar to what it is. Like we're telling the same jokes or kind of jokes, and we're talking about our lives a little bit, and we're taunting each other depending on the fortunes of the game. Like if that technology didn't exist, that would suck. Because 3 or 4 hours go by in a flash. What I don't like is when people are like, let's just hang out on video and just shoot the shit. Because that's kind of lame anyway in real life. And it's especially like with the 1 second voice lag, because you end up with just people talking over each other.
It's not
So
lame in real life. It's great in real life. It's lame on Zoom because, yeah, everyone talks at the same time and there's not the one. I mean, my favorite activity to do is to like sit on a bar stool next to somebody and do shots of whiskey and
the
then
last
talk
time
shit
I
about
did that,
everyone else in the bar. So
the
you've got to be
last
close.
time I did that, the last time I did that, I was with you in at that douche bar in Vancouver. Remember? I was
Oh,
like,
oh man,
yeah,
I love that bar. That is like the best people watching bar in Vancouver. I mean, it's such an odd place to hang out,
yeah,
but I
that was
really love
like,
it. Like if you want to see all the plastic surgery and
yeah,
Botox and injections and like
yes.
sequin dresses, like
But it was so weird. And this is obviously a tangent to a tangent, but because from following the culture wars, you kind of think that everybody in Vancouver dresses in a potato sack and has 14 pronouns and no jobs and 3 government grants. Like, because those are the people from Vancouver who are shrieking the loudest on Twitter about how their soul has been exterminated because you didn't pronounce the name of their Patronus the right way or whatever. But then you go to Vancouver to these like high class bars, and wow, I mean that was quite a scene. And that is the last time I've been in. That was a couple of months ago at least, and that's the
That's
last time I've been.
funny. Oh, I
Sorry,
mean, I said that it's funny that's the last time that you did that. I mean, that
that was
was
like 6 months ago or something. Yeah.
November. Was that November?
And the time before, the previous time was when you were in Toronto, the month before that,
Oh.
where I met that cool guy who reviews video games, who has a video channel. He was like a boyfriend of one of your colleagues. He had the
Okay.
YouTube
Oh,
channel where
okay.
he had the YouTube channel where he was super cool. Yeah.
Okay. So,
So
well,
go to
I'm
the
really
bars.
sorry for forcing you out into these horrible
No,
situations.
no, he was cool, and I did see the other fashionable side of Vancouver. But I guess the short version of this is I'm not giving up that much by not being able to go to bars. Like I only go to bars with turfs. And, and if there aren't turfs getting mobbed, I'm like not interested in going to bars. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
That's
that's like the polar opposite of me. I love a bar. But I mean, yeah, and the other great thing about that bar, that was the Pac Rim, was that I knew that there would be no protesters there because there's no way anyone in that bar or near that bar would allow one of those
God.
people to.
No, those guys would have protested if there was no Grey Goose. Like they were they that was like next level.
Oh, I'm
I don't
glad. I'm glad you had
douche
that
is a very
experience.
judgmental word, but I mean there was a lot of money in that room.
Oh
Uh,
man, yeah, it's nuts.
yeah.
So okay, and finally, I really wanted to ask you. I mean, we've all been struggling in a lot of different ways, mostly because we haven't been able to get our hair cut, our roots
I hear you, sister.
done.
I hear you, sister.
Like,
Yeah.
how have you been coping? Do you have any hair care tips for COVID?
Yeah, I mean, hair care is obviously strangers ask me about hair care because because I look like this. And my family, I'm the only male. I'm the only one who uses male pronouns. And there's been a lot of collective hair care. So my oldest daughter has cut my hair twice. She has done some color stuff on my wife. I'm not going to go into detail because I've heard this is sensitive. She's cut the hair of our youngest, and she's like really good at it. Like the first haircut she gave me was a little bit all over the place, but the second haircut she got was like, that's a really good haircut. Now, I should say the normal guy who cuts my hair charge is this Chinese guy who charges me $11 and actually watches a movie on his phone while he's cutting my hair. So my standard for like service in hair care is not high, but she met that standard. And and this is one of the reasons, by the way, I think the economy, it might be slow to bounce back because there's a lot of things that we never thought we could do for ourselves that we can do. Like in a million years, I never would have asked my daughter to give me a haircut. But now that she's done it twice, I kind of feel weird about going back to the guy watching Chinese soap operas on his phone while he cuts my hair. Um, the other thing is, I'm a fan of the sitcom Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Have you
Okay.
ever seen it?
A couple times.
Are you familiar with the protagonist, Jake Peralta?
No,
So,
I don't remember. I don't know
okay.
anything about it.
Well,
Well, not much.
in
I know
season
that it
four,
exists. Sorry.
okay.
Yeah.
So I'll continue the conversation despite the fact you don't know Brooklyn Nine-Nine baseball or board games. But um,
Thank you.
uh, we have nothing in common. So in season four, it's now in season seven. In season four, there's this plot arc where, as I said, it's comedy, and Jake Peralta and his boss go undercover in Florida, and the producer of the show, he's produced other shows, he like he hates Florida. So whenever his characters go to Florida, he just like mercilessly mocks the state. And so when Jake goes to Florida, he gets these like white trash blonde tips at the end of his hair. So and I remember watching it. I was like, whoa, that's so cool. It's like his hair is brown, but there's like this blonde stuff at the end of it. Like,
Dude, you're
and
like, I don't know, 15 years too late on that. You're like, what did he do to his
so
hair?
yeah, no, I was like, it's like, wow, he split the atom. And so I remember telling my family, I said, uh, like if I'm ever gonna get tips, bleach tips, I think they're called. Like now is the time to do it. It's not like I'm not going to a job interview or I barely go outside. So I went to Shoppers Drug Mart and the pharmacy, and I had this tortured conversation with this like 22-year-old guy. We were both wearing masks. He had no idea. Like, there's a whole, by the way, if you go to the pharmacy, like there's this whole section of hair dye.
Yeah.
Like I expected it'd be like, yellow, red, brown, black. And I'd get like the yellow one and I'd put it, but it's not like that at all. There's like all these brands
I
and
feel like everyone knows this except for you. And you're like, you guys, did you
this
know?
guy and this guy was no help at all. And it's like, and there's like 1,000 women smiling back at us from these packages, and they're all like this, and I'm like, yeah, I want that color, but this is a 10-day and this is a 3-day. So I got it, I brought it home, and you open it up. I don't know if you ever open this. It's like a chemistry set. There's gloves and like something that looks like a pregnancy test, and then you mix it in a bowl, and then there's like this plastic hat you put on. And the first time I did it was a complete failure. It turned my hair like eggplant colored, which I kind
Oh
of like,
no. You
but
didn't
actually
post
was.
any photos of that.
Well, I posted one on Facebook, which I'll
Oh,
send
I
you.
didn't
But
see
the eggplant thing was good because it made like a good base for the blonde. And then on Facebook, my friend Marnie Supkoff said, no, no, to get the bleach tips, it actually has bleach in it because it literally has bleach in it. So I got Walmart.ca sent me the necessary product. And as soon as I opened it, I could tell, like, you can smell the bleach. Like, it smelled different from the other one. It smelled like something Donald Trump would tell you to drink to get rid of COVID-19. It was like, oh yeah, this is the real deal because it's hurting my eyes. And then I put it on the tent. Now my hair is really short. I have male pattern baldness, so I don't have a lot of hair to work with. But I did get the bleach tips Florida 1995 look for 3 or 4 glorious days. But then the gray grew back in, so my hair was like gray eggplant bleach blonde, which no one wanted to see. It was only like an 8 on a 1 to 10. So thankfully, the lockdown has gone on long enough that now I'm just kind of back to gray,
Okay.
and everyone is much happier now. But I did get a good picture, which I'll forward it to you on Facebook.
Oh, I can't believe I
Uh,
missed it. Okay.
well, I think I briefly turned it to my profile photo, but then changed it due to widespread disgust, and now my profile photo is Lego, which
Yeah, I
everyone is
think
much
I
happier.
saw that one. Yeah.
But
The
you know what? I'm
Lego.
happy I did it because if not now, when?
So
Like,
exactly. I mean, that was a really courageous experiment. Do you think that you'll continue after COVID to, work
no,
on
no,
your tips?
no, absolutely not. I was shocked at how like much work it took.
Yeah.
I mean, I assumed it was something like spray paint, but there was a lot of work, and also there's a lot of like there was a wide variety of chemicals because you expect you open it up and if it's brown, it'll be brown, but it's not. There was like a white paste and like kind of an oil that you add together, and it's not, and then you add it to, and you have no idea what color it's going to look. You just don't trust. You just trust that it's going to be the color on the box.
I
It's an act of trust. It's a
I
Clairol. Yeah,
I
it's weird.
can't believe that
It's
you've
really yeah,
never like that you have no idea how hair dye works. I mean, like
and it's not
I've
cheap.
dyed my hair countless times. Now I get my hair done professionally. I haven't done anything to my hair since lockdown, but when I was younger, I would dye my hair all the time. So I'm so surprised that you've never encountered this before in your your life because I
Oh,
feel like
and it's
most women
exhausting.
probably have.
But I did go through this weird phase where I was watching hair colorist videos. Because when I Googled bleach tips, this guy, he wasn't just some random guy. He was the colorist of the year of 2018. So if you Google colorist of the year, his videos are really good. But all of the people who he did had much more hair than me. Like it was just I was not a representative hair model for the people he was working with. So
Uh-huh. Hmm.
I didn't
Hmm.
connect. I didn't connect.
Okay.
But I got it like a glimpse into this whole industry. Like this industry is clearly worth a ton of cash. These products are not cheap. So it was educational.
Yeah, educational for everyone who's watching as well,
I,
I'm sure.
I think so. I think so. Anyway, but thank you for your interest. Um, it yeah no and plus like my kids I've been trying to convince my kids to experiment with stuff. My eldest she dyed her hair like a color she never would have dyed her hair before. She didn't like it at all, but this is the time to do it. This is
I
the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean we're almost done now, so I think it's
Yep.
probably I wouldn't recommend anyone start dyeing their hair just now because I think we probably got like what, a couple more weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if you have very short hair, maybe like this is the last day or two to do it.
Okay, okay, right. This
Yeah.
is my like hair privilege talking where I'm like, a couple of weeks, like
Yeah. No. 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 It is.
like a
You
couple
are
of weeks for me, like it would. I mean, that would be like 7 years to grow out again.
that.
Like
Wow.
if I did it now, I would, like I wouldn't be safe in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I can do a new hair experiment like every 4 days.
Yeah, for me it's a
It's
big deal, which is why I haven't touched it. So I'm hoping that I can get a haircut in like maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Am I crazy?
Yeah, so you have you tried at all, like a friend
No, I'm
or
not
like,
letting a friend touch my hair. No.
okay, so like I said, if we ever go back into lockdown, I will say this. The first haircut I got from my daughter was bad. She learned, and the second haircut was good. So
I think
if
we're
you're
in
willing,
very different situations hair
okay, all
wise.
right,
No
okay,
offense, but I
okay,
mean, I think that my
okay.
hair standards are different than your hair standards, and that my hair needs, I'm not sure you quite understand my hair needs versus your hair needs.
I'm
And it
closer to
might seem
understanding it.
simple, it does just look
Yeah.
like I have a bunch of hair.
I'm closer to understanding it now that I've had this Clairol experience. That was very
Right.
enlightening. Yep.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it was really interesting talking to you, as always, of course, but specifically about this. And I've actually really appreciated all your reporting that you've been doing all this, and that somebody else is studying the data, because I find data quite intimidating and hard to get my head around. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I look forward to us being in the same city again because apparently that's the only time I go to cool bars. So,
Yeah, same, same. I hope so as well. Okay, awesome. Have
talk
a
soon.
really great night. Talk to you
Bye,
soon.
everybody. Bye.
Bye.